For Russia, all of these things are interrelated. They are weaponizing risk to try to compel the United States and the West into making some concessions on Ukraine. My argument has been that we have overestimated the risks and therefore allowed the Kremlin to constantly recalibrate and adapt such that it doesn't have the impact that it could have had on the battlefield.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Andrea Kendall-Taylor. Andrea is a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, where she's a specialist on Russia. Prior to her current work there, she had a distinguished career as an intelligence officer for the CIA, where she focused on Russia and regularly briefed the White House. She also focuses on the rise of authoritarianism and threats to democracy, and has recently co-authored a book on the subject titled The Origins of Elected Strongmen. Today, we have a discussion on the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what the U.S. might have done differently from a negotiation perspective there. We also talk about the current state of the war and what we might do to get Putin to the negotiation table. We end our discussion today talking about the rise of authoritarianism around the world and especially in our own country and our vulnerabilities there. Welcome to the podcast, Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
It's great to be here, Stan. Thanks for having me.
There's so many things we could talk about. The one I want to focus on the most on today is the role of negotiation in the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But before we get there, and some of our listeners, in fact, probably a majority of our listeners weren't alive during the collapse of the former Soviet Union in 1991. Give us the context for what it felt like to Russia post-91. How did that kind of set the table for some of the ensuing conflicts, initially Georgia, then Crimea? Give us a little bit of cultural and political context for what's leading up to Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a big question. Obviously, what's happening all around Russia has different characteristics based on the countries that are experiencing those things. But the big bumper sticker is that the 1990s, in particular and early 2000s, was incredibly tumultuous. And Russians look back at that time and remember it as a time of weakness, as a time of poverty. There was a lot of uncertainty, and disorder is the big word that I think sticks with most Russians. Working with Russia during that time and thinking about U.S.-Russia relations, it was a constant challenge to work productively with the Kremlin. And there were kind of these constant periods of dialogue and optimism followed by very tense periods and confrontation. And I guess just to open the aperture a little bit, just remember all of the things that were going on. You had the Transnistria war, all of the conflict over the separation of Transnistria off of Moldova. There was another conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave. You had the Balkan Wars in the late 1990s. In Russia, you had the Chechen War in 1999. So there was a whole lot of angst, chaos, and for Russia, a constant struggle to try to hold on to the sense of empire and maintain the influence that they had grown so accustomed to having.
One of the things I was involved in, I think we've talked about this in the past, in the conflict between Georgia and Abkhazia in the early days, and I was surprised at how non-Russian both of those republics seemed. Abkhazia and Georgia didn't seem like they, to me, belonged to Russia in that time. And it just felt to me like Russia had these, 15 republics that didn't necessarily go together. And so if you look at the USSR and the history, it's not clear to me that it ever made sense for it to be together in the first place. Do you see that any differently?
No, I think it's still very much a patchwork. You think about the Central Asian republics that, look and feel much differently than a lot of parts of Russia. The Georgians, to your point, their own unique language, their own history, very much their own food and cuisine. The Baltic countries, very different. Again, so yes, it very much was a patchwork that was stitched together and held together. And when that glue came undone, you had countries eager to move in very different directions in many cases. But with this constant effort by the Kremlin to hold on to that empire, and if you think about Putin's own statements, he calls the collapse of the Soviet Union, the greatest travesty that he has experienced. And so That I think has been that battle for influence has been what's characterized that post-Soviet experience up to this point. And in many ways, the kind of breakup and dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine war is still part of that.
Yeah. Let's fast forward to 2008. You mentioned several of the conflicts that a lot of listeners wouldn't be familiar with. I think I'd never heard of Abkhazia before I went there and was mediated between the Georgians and the Abkhaz. But let's fast forward to 2008 when Russia invades Georgia. Most listeners would be familiar with that. Essentially they teamed up with Abkhazia and South Ossetia against Georgia. And that'd be a fun thing to talk about on another podcast. But from a negotiation perspective, should we have done more to help Georgia in that conflict?
Well, I think to me, the most important point is thinking about Georgia as really the beginning of this pattern that we've seen now leading up to the Ukraine war. And so what you saw, Putin had given this big speech in Munich in 2007, where he really kind of throws down the gauntlet and he reveals really all of this disdain for the United States and resentment about what the West has done. And then it continues from that point, like you said, with the invasion of Georgia in 2008. And I think it was our lack of response, our inability to impose costs that would be significant enough to signal to Russia that you can't do these types of things. Yeah, it was the lack of a response then, and then again in 2014, and we'll continue to talk through this timeline, I'm sure. But it really is the lack of response from the West to impose significant costs on Russia for its actions that set the stage for what happened in 2022.
Well, let's talk about 2014. That was another stage, as you mentioned. He went and pretty aggressively took Crimea. I was assuming that Obama would have responded more strongly and chose not to. So give us your analysis of that. Should Obama and the administration have done more to respond and drawn the line at Crimea?
Well, I think just a quick reminder for the events that led up to the illegal annexation of Crimea. You remember that there was growing rapport between Ukraine and the West. And you had the Maidan protests that erupted over then President Yanukovych's decision to not sign the trade agreement with the European Union and instead move more closely to Russia. And you had then this groundswell of opposition to this decision that ultimately led to President Yanukovych fleeing. And that sparked a lot of fear inside Russia about losing influence over Ukraine and particularly over Crimea, where they host the Black Sea Fleet, one of their most important military bases. It gives them a warm water port. And so Russia used that as an opportunity to send in these little green men. And so what we have to remember, it wasn't the overt show of force that we saw in 2022. This was the first of this hybrid war. It was very unclear. I was in the U.S. intelligence community at the time, and I think there was a lot of uncertainty in the opening hours about what even was happening. And so it was difficult. I think, the Ukraine then is different than what Ukraine is now. This was a hybrid war. It was unlike anything the West had seen. And you have to remember that there was also, I think the United States had been paying most attention to the war on terror. Russia at that time was kind of a backwater, a policy backwater. No one much cared about it. No one was watching. So it came as a huge surprise. And it's the same for the Europeans as well. There was not the kind of solidarity and cohesion and consensus amongst our European allies about the nature of the Russian threat early. And so in many ways, it's understandable that the response was as muted as it was. It basically entailed a bunch of sanctions to try to weaken Russia and prevent it from going into eastern Ukraine. So what's the saying? The appetite grows with the eating. And Putin becomes more and more willing over time to take on more and more risk as he sees that the costs are tolerable.
So in retrospect, it's always easy in hindsight to say we should have been tougher, but it sounds like you're saying from a negotiation perspective, we probably should have bumped him on the nose a little bit there rather than just whetting his appetite for Ukraine. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. So basically, the response after the illegal annexation of Crimea was to slap on a bunch of sanctions. And they weren't particularly strong or convincing sanctions. They didn't have much impact on Russia's economy or its ability to feed its military machine. It was also really hard to get the Europeans to come along with us. You didn't have, again, that decisive shift in European attitude. So the lack of a response basically, I think, convinced Putin that the West was weak and that they wouldn't be willing to come down decisively against future actions. And so again, I think that was perhaps amongst the most important things that set the stage for 2022 was the very lackluster and muted response to the illegal annexation of Crimea and subsequent occupation of Ukraine in 2014 and then 2015.
Well, let's jump up to Ukraine, because that's what I'm sure what listeners are most interested in, since it's an ongoing war. I'm taking from what you're saying that we may have been a little bit naive about Putin's intentions. This is there's a lot of data now, whether it's Georgia, Crimea, other things that Putin has done to signal to us that he has continued expansive interests. I'm very worried that if we don't hold the line at Ukraine, there are a bunch of people next, the Baltics, we could talk about where he might go next. But have we consistently been naive about Putin's intentions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the picture that you and I are painting here. So it was obviously the 2008 invasion of Georgia. It was the 2014 the illegal annexation of Crimea and occupation of Ukraine. But then you'll remember in 2015, Putin inserts forces into Syria to try to back up Assad, the dictator there. Our 2016 election, when he's meddling in our elections and interfering in that to try to shape the outcome. And in each of those cases, it was largely a lackluster response. I mean, you're exactly right. And it's that you're exactly right that we haven't read his intentions properly. And if you think back to the 2007 speech at Munich, we didn't take it seriously, or we didn't take it seriously. So Putin now kind of infamously published an op-ed on Ukraine and the way that he understands Russian and Ukrainian history that was very clear in its imperialist ambitions. That happened just before the 2022 invasion. So I would argue that Putin has consistently signposted, he's clearly communicated his intentions. And there's been a lot of la, 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 wishful thinking. We don't want to hear it. We've consistently underestimated what it is he's trying to achieve. And now, I mean, I would say the 22 invasion of Ukraine is his point of no return. There's no turning back now. He wants to subjugate not just Ukraine, but he's also clear that he sees this as a broader civilizational conflict. He is at war with the West, whether we want to see it that way or not. And so, Stan, I think you're exactly right that if we fail to come to some sort of agreement or end to this war that is on Ukraine's terms, I worry very much that Putin will continue to press on with his goals of trying to undermine NATO in the West.
Yeah, you and I are in agreement on this. I'm trying to decide whether to dive into NATO, and I'm just going to do it very briefly. There's definitely a school of thought that would say we put a bullseye on Ukraine's back by creating an open door policy and communicating almost aggressively that we would consider having Ukraine part of NATO. Mistake, not a mistake? What's your quick analysis of that?
I think it was a mistake. And I think if we were serious about bringing Ukraine into NATO, that we should have moved expeditiously and convincingly in that direction. But when I say it's a mistake, I say it because I think we need to learn from that mistake. We have to learn, we have to understand that a gray zone, this gray space is something that Putin will try to exploit and take advantage of. And so now thinking about Ukraine's future, I do think we have to move much more concertedly to bring Ukraine into NATO, because until we do that, I'm not convinced that we'll have a lasting end to this war. I mean, the United States and Europe has said we need to come to some sort of agreement or end to this war such that Russia never tries this again. And I think that's only possible once Ukraine is firmly inside NATO.
The argument against that, of course, is that that's even more inflammatory and even pokes the bear more. I think I hear what you're saying, which is he's already been poked. This is war. It's existential from his perspective. So what? Is that fair?
I think he's already been poked, but I think more importantly, he's demonstrated what his objectives are. He wants to fully subjugate Ukraine. He wants to control Kyiv and its choices. And I don't think that there's much that the United States can do short of providing that Article 5, that agreement of collective defense, that will be sufficient to deter Putin from trying this again.
So things like sanctions, export controls feel like sort of marginal responses to you, I'm guessing, than really structural, substantive responses. Or what would your analysis of those be?
Well, I think they're an important part of the response. It's hard to imagine a response to what Russia did absent sanctions and export controls. And they do serve an important part of victory for Ukraine. I mean, the goal of the sanctions is to really weaken Russia's war-making capacity. The sanctions and the export controls are designed to prohibit Moscow from getting its hands on the chips and the components and the other things that it needs to build the weapons that it's using to strike Ukraine. So they're a really important part in weakening Russia's capacity for aggression beyond its own borders, but they're not sufficient on their own.
So, Andrea, one of the things that I worry about is that Putin's fighting a war of attrition, and he might win a war of attrition unless we're willing to step up what we provide to Ukraine. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that you're right that he believes he can wait the West out and that they will outproduce the West. We've already seen in Russia that they've shifted entirely their economy to a wartime footing. From the opening days of the war, their factories were producing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They've increased their defense spending above 6%. They're outproducing what they did in terms of tanks and other things relative to their pre-war production. So they've turned it up, and the West has not. We have not gotten serious about getting our defense industry into a place that could help sustain Ukraine over the long term. And I do believe that Putin understands that, and therefore it feeds his conviction that he can wait the West out.
Okay, let's complexify. One thing I say in my negotiation classes, in international relations, there really aren't any two-party negotiations. You've written about and talked about what you call the axis of upheaval. If we add China, Iran, North Korea to Russia, you're calling that the axis of upheaval. How does that play? They've essentially, in my view, been brought together because of the U.S., in response to the U.S., as opposed to they started with other common interests. So what should we be doing from a negotiation perspective with any or all of those countries?
Well, I mean, I agree with the premise that the Western response to these countries has facilitated the deepening of their cooperation. But let's not forget why the Western response has been what it is, right? We've been so hard on Russia because they violated international norms. They have invaded a neighbor. They illegally annexed Ukraine. China, for its part, acting increasingly provocative in the South China Sea, doing other things. So the Western response has been largely in reaction to behavior that we would say is undermining the quote-unquote rules-based system or the international system as it exists. So there's a reason for the response, but you're right, with the sanctions and this belief that you can't have better relations with the West has provided a powerful motivation for them to seek out then other like-minded partners. And it plays such an important role in the Ukraine war because these countries are enabling Russia's war machine. So Iran, for its part, has sent all of these drones that Russia is using to target Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure, not to mention other types of missiles. The North Koreans, for their part, have sent millions of rounds of ammunition in a war where ammunition has really been a commodity. They're also sending different types of ballistic missiles. And then China has been the most important lifeline for Russia in the way that it's continued to buy oil and gas, sending the billions of dollars into Russia's coffers. And it's making available the chips and component parts and other things that have been cut off by the West that's helping Russia build its missiles and other things. So these countries have allowed Russia to sustain its war in a way that wouldn't have been possible without their backing. And so when we're thinking about a response, negotiation, sanctions, other things, we have to think about trying to deter those countries, impose costs of their enablement of Russia's war machine. That's an important piece of this.
Let's dive in specifically on any of the other three countries and anything that we could do unilaterally to change their choice. It's my view that that coalition, the axis of upheaval, is more convenience than deep. Even with China, the most important party. I think while much is made in the U.S. of Xi and Putin's discussion of a relationship without limits, I think China is mostly interested in China, and they're not that excited about this war. Obviously, we're going to have a long-term relationship, coopetition, whatever you want to call it, with China. Are there things that we could do to change China's choice in this war from a negotiation perspective?
Well, I think we're trying. But first of all, I think I would probably characterize the relationship a little bit different. And what may have started as a marriage of convenience, with the repeated interactions and the trust and the confidence that they're building in one another, I think that is building the foundations for a more durable and meaningful relationship. And although China might not have been crazy about the invasion in 2022 to begin with, I think that they value the fact that Russia is the pointy end of the spear. They value the fact that Russia is willing to act out and do things that help undermine the order that China thinks disadvantages Beijing. So it is all about China. But in that sense, Russia is an incredibly useful partner, and one that, even though they're having to incur some costs because of now from the Europeans and others, even though they're now incurring costs because of that relationship, they haven't backed away. I mean, I think it's very clear where Beijing's loyalties lie, and they lie firmly with Russia. So what could we do? I don't think that there's a lot. The United States has talked about secondary sanctions and trying to enforce existing sanctions more forcefully. So the sanctions enforcement is a big piece of this. And then trying to think about secondary sanctions. But I do think that the Europeans actually may hold more leverage in trying to shape China's calculus, because we know that Beijing cares a lot about European markets. They want also a Europe that sits on the fence and isn't all in with the United States in a broader kind of, U.S.-China confrontation. And so having the Europeans apply more pressure and trying to use sanctions, using their markets and other things to signal that there will be costs for China's continued support for Russia. That's maybe where there might be more leverage.
I really agree with that. And I just want to underscore that I think China's main interest of the ones that you prioritize is economics. And it's my feeling that if we were lockstep with our allies, not only European allies, but Australia, Japan, you think of our principal folks in the Pacific that we are tightly aligned with. If we came together economically, I think we could get China to back away from its support of Russia, at least to the extent that they are. Because, is this really an alliance? Have these parties, these four countries, even ever met together? I don't think so. I think these are one-off relationships that Russia is using advantageously. China is obviously super upset about our current policy on Taiwan. I don't think we should throw that into the mix yet, but I think we should be more united with our allies in our economic response to China, is my view.
Yeah, the trick is, though, so to take Germany as an example, so the Germans would say, we just fully diversified our economy away from Russia. We had to stop buying Russian oil and gas. Because European trade ties with Russia were far more significant than U.S. trade ties. And so they've gone through all of these growing pains of reorienting away from Russia. So you will hear from Germans, like, we can't have an economic war on two fronts. Like, that is too economically painful. And that's why I do think it's been hard to create the cohesion that you're talking about. German cars, that industry is too important. And so it's hard to get the Europeans to be on exactly the same page, in large part because it would be economically, I think, very painful for them to have that economic confrontation coming not now just with Russia, but now also with China.
I don't disagree with that, but I guess the element that I would add is I think over time that argument becomes less true. I was surprised that the Germans weaned themselves to a significant extent off the Russian energy over the time period that they did. And so I think that leverage is short term. My big worry in the US is domestic politics. I think if we focused on isolationist policies, we lose to China on so many fronts. And I just think I'm curious if you agree with that, because I just feel like we're missing the fact that isolationism hurts our economy, isolationism hurts our security, and for some reason we're not talking about that. Do you agree, or am I oversimplifying?
No, I agree very much. There definitely is a loud call in Washington, D.C. of people who want to see the United States do less in the international community, on the international stage. And I do worry a lot about that impulse. I guess Ukraine is a great example. And if the United States isn't involved in supporting Ukraine, and by the way, it's a tiny fraction of our overall GDP. It's a tiny 2%, I think, of our annual defense spending. It's a very small cost we're paying to help Ukrainians defend themselves from Russian aggression. And, thinking of this axis of upheaval, helping Ukraine, I think, is the most urgent and important thing the United States can do to compete with the growing coordination amongst our allies, because it will help deter China and it will isolate Iran. If we can help defeat Russia, it does quite a lot for our own security and prosperity over the longer term.
Completely agree with that. I think that's well said. Let's just touch on the nuclear issue. I've been a little surprised. Putin's done some hand waving on the nuclear, but not been very specific. What's your view on how nuclear weapons factor into our ongoing negotiation with Putin about Ukraine?
Well, we should note first and foremost that since the invasion of Ukraine, the arms control framework that exists, this kind of patchwork, lattice work of arms control agreements that limits nuclear weapons and other things, has fallen apart in the aftermath of the invasion. So
when you say falling apart, I assume what you mean is we're not talking anymore. We don't have dialogue on arms control.
We don't. Well, not only are we not talking, but they've suspended their participation in the New START treaty, for example, one of the most important agreements that limits the number of warheads that the two sides have. The INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that Russia has suspended its participation in that. So it's there that not only are we not talking, but they've shredded up some of these existing frameworks. And it's really consequential because that New START treaty, which is really critically important to, I think, our security and limiting risks between the United States and Russia, that treaty is set to expire. And the United States, recognizing the importance of having these types of agreements for our own security, had said to Russia, we're willing to resume discussions about renewing, or it's not really renewing, but because it expires in 2025, so we need a new agreement. And Jake Sullivan in the White House said, Russia, we're willing to talk to you without conditions to see if we can begin discussing what a follow-on agreement looks like. And Russia said, thanks, but no thanks, because they're trying to weaponize risk. For Russia, all of these things are interrelated. They link what's happening in Ukraine with their arms control agreements. And they're basically trying to intimidate the United States and particularly our European allies and create a risk environment that they're hoping we will say, wow, this is getting too much out of hand. Russia, we're willing to make some concessions to get you back to the table because we don't like this level of risk. So they are weaponizing risk to try to compel the United States and the West into making some concessions on Ukraine. So it's all linked.
Seems like a risky strategy from a negotiation perspective that Russia is taking. It's essentially a bluff, right? And playing chicken. My guess is that doesn't end up working. I'd also take away from what you're saying that the risks that we are taking in our relationship with Ukraine are worth it, right? You wouldn't say the risk of a nuclear event, the risk of destroying our relationships outside of Russia, our risks to our relationship with China. You'd say it's all worth it, right? You're in favor of what we're doing overall is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, definitely in favor. And I think I'm a little bit disappointed that Russia's nuclear intimidation has worked as well as it has. You'll hear from the White House that the risk of escalation has been perhaps the most important factor or criteria that they apply in trying to decide what they will and won't do for Ukraine. And in a way, it is understandable. But the United States has been, I think, too paralyzed by the fear of the risk and therefore has been too slow in what it's been willing to provide. When you hear the White House talk about it, they talk about it like it's been a concerted strategy, like boiling a frog in a pot of water. And they view it as prudent. And in many ways, it has been because we've avoided that worst case scenario. But again, my argument has been that we have overestimated the risks and therefore acted too slowly with what we've been willing to provide and therefore allowed the Kremlin to constantly recalibrate and adapt to what we give the Ukrainians such that it doesn't have the impact that it could have had on the battlefield.
Yeah, I'd say two things from a negotiation perspective. It feels like we're making some assumptions that we maybe should question. And we're also letting them set the table a little bit and reacting to our assumptions about what might happen. And I agree with you that, if Putin was going to use even a tactical nuclear weapon, he probably would have done that in the short term. And I think he knows that that's a red line. He looks at the mistakes we made in Georgia and Crimea and thinks that maybe we're not going to react to anything. I think any use of a nuclear weapon would create a massive response from the U.S. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that from the U.S., from our allies, and potentially from China. But the one point I'll make in terms of believing that Putin's red lines are as firm as they are, this whole Kursk incursion into Ukraine. The Ukrainians have now made an offensive military move and occupy something like 500 square miles of Russian territory. And that has not been enough to elicit any major Russian response. And when you hear the Ukrainians' rationale for why they did it, there's many, but one of their talking points is that they wanted to demonstrate to the West that Putin's red lines aren't what we think that they are. They were willing to blow by these so-called red lines, and there hasn't been a response. So again, there were many reasons why they went forward with the Kursk operation, but in hindsight, one talking point that I think is a pretty valid one is it demonstrates that Russia's red lines are not as firm as we make them out to be, and they are often very context dependent.
Sounds like there's something we could probably learn from the Ukrainians about negotiation in terms of testing those red lines. And so I thought the same thing. I thought, wow, that was a risky strategy, but it worked. It's largely worked. The big problem, of course, from a moral perspective is continued loss of life on both sides. And I don't see a lot of progress. We talked about this being a war of attrition. Is there anything we could or should do to get Russia to the negotiation table to stop, the needless loss of life in a war of attrition?
But I do think is a good idea. I mean, it's almost impossible, and I shouldn't say impossible. Nothing's impossible, but very hard to imagine that Ukraine would be able to expel Russia from its territory militarily. So that to me, I think everyone has kind of now accepted that outcome is unlikely. And people are now looking to try to build leverage in a future negotiation. And if you remember, I think the White House's position from very early on is that we are going to help support Ukraine to put them in the best possible position on the battlefield so that they will be in the best possible position at a future negotiating table. And so I think that still has to be what our strategy is. Russia and Ukraine are still miles and miles and miles apart in terms of what they would accept as an outcome at the negotiating table. But I think this Kursk invasion is part of what Zelensky is now talking about, his theory of victory. I think that they recognize that you will not get the Russians to engage in a genuine negotiation until Putin believes that he doesn't want to do this indefinitely, that the costs will be too much, that there'll be risks to domestic stability, that they won't be able to sustain it indefinitely. And so this Kursk invasion, I think, was to drive home the point to Putin that, and to try to change that overall calculus. So what does the United States need to do? Well, the United States needs to first and most immediately remove some of these restrictions that we're placing on Ukraine about striking targets in Russian territory. We still put very heavy restrictions and limits on how Ukraine can use the weapons that we give them. And so just recently, the Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, and Umerov, the Minister of Defense, were here in Washington with a list of targets that they were hoping to get approval for, to be able to strike all military targets, of course, to be able to strike. So I think that's an important piece of it. That's not going to be a game changer. It's not going to allow Ukraine to win the war, but it has to get harder for Russia. They have to feel that there are costs. I think Putin has to feel that there could be some risks to domestic stability, that his hold on power could be compromised over time if Russians themselves don't want the war to be waged on Russian territory. So I think what the U.S. has to do is to help support Ukraine change that calculus about and convince Putin that he can't do this indefinitely. And then perhaps you could enter into a negotiation and reach some sort of outcome that would be at least acceptable to Kyiv.
So it sounds like you would be more permissive in terms of things like allowing Ukraine to make further incursions into Russia. You'd probably maybe increase our budget to them. You characterize it as, a good deal for us, and maybe get in a better place to negotiate. One of the underlying things with this war is just the increasing trend towards authoritarianism. Both Putin and Xi are authoritarian leaders. They see, I think, an existential battle in form of government, much like we used to see democracy as an existential aim in our foreign policy. I think we've backed off that a little bit. But I think this ties in nicely with some work that you've recently done. You've just co-authored a book that I'd recommend to everyone called The Origins of Elected Strongmen, where you really talk about the problems, even within democracies, of authoritarian tendencies. And before we talk a little bit about the book, maybe just characterize Xi and Putin in their dynamic. We're calling the personalization of leadership is a term that you and others have used. So they're very different in their authoritarianism. And so just give listeners just a brief tour on how each of them use personalization to enhance authoritarian goals.
Yeah, like you said, they started out from very different places. So Putin has been a personalist leader. It's, where power really sits in the hands of an individual, and they tend to be surrounded by cronies and other yes men who tell them what they want to hear. But kind of close personal colleagues, a lot of people in Putin's inner circle are people he did business with back in St. Petersburg when he was there. People that have been with Putin for a very long time. They're all Putin's people. Xi Jinping came to power in a very different circumstance where he had the backing of the Chinese Communist Party. So a huge party where people advance through the party ranks. It's a very different type of authoritarian system. But the remarkable thing has been to see how Xi is personalizing power with all of the corruption. He's basically weaponized those purges to go after people who he doesn't want in his inner circle. And he is increasingly picking people who have personal loyalties to him in the senior party leadership. And, we wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs called The New Dictators many, many years ago, warning about the perils of personalism. And this was before the invasion of Ukraine, but one of the perils of personalism is and there's a big body of academic research that shows that these personalist leaders are the most likely to start wars and most likely to fight against democracies, in large part because they're prone to miscalculation. Because they have the yes men and those people around them, they make big, costly mistakes. And so that played out, it would be a classic example, a case study of the perils of personalism, Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I now worry a lot about what's happening in China. And if we could see something similar where Xi could make some significant miscalculation that would lead him to act more aggressively towards Taiwan and ultimately, wage an invasion, which is what people are worried about. But I think the personalism is an important factor that makes it hard to gauge decision-making in these contexts.
Yeah. And so, statements like George Bush famously made years ago of, I looked into Putin's eyes and what was the specific thing that he said?
Oh, I can't even remember now that you put me on the spot. It's so famous.
Well, it was something to the effect of, I know I can work with this guy or I can trust him or whatever he said.
And I saw a soul, or wasn't that it?
Yeah.
And then someone else said, I looked in Putin's eyes and I saw a brutal dictator. I don't know what.
Right. And from a negotiation perspective, putting too much faith in one's ability to either know another person or read another person brings up exactly what you said, which is huge risks. I can't help but transition a little bit to our current situation in the U.S. You write about this where the Republican Party is really, I think, being held hostage by a personalized leader. So talk a little bit about that and what you write about in your book there that is happening. I guess the pointed question I would ask is the Republican Party becoming a personalist party?
I think categorically, yes. And maybe just to rewind one quick second. So the Origins of Elected Strongmen is about this process of personalization in democracies. And I wrote it with two colleagues, Erica France and Joe Wright, both who are scholars of authoritarianism. The three of us went to graduate school together, have studied autocracies our whole life. And we were really struck by the similar tendencies that we were starting to see in democratic settings. And this personalization of politics and democracies as scholars of personalism in autocracies really jumped out at us. And so we wanted to measure it. We wanted to understand it. Is politics becoming more personalized in democracies? And so we went about measuring it. We put together a whole quantitative index based on a number of key components, these indicators of personalism. And if you look at the United States and what's happening with the Republican Party, the data that, if you look at it, shows a significant uptick in levels of personalism in the United States under Donald Trump. And that's in large part because we typically have had leaders who rise through the ranks of their parties. Thinking of Bush or Clinton or other people who held elected office in other positions. Trump kind of swoops in as this outsider. And if you remember, he actually was not a Republican. He was a Democrat earlier in his life, switched parties. And so he is this implant on top of the party. And the way we conceptualize personalism is really about a leader's relationship to the political party that backs them. And because Trump had very little pre-existing relationship with the party, those levels of personalism have gone up. And you look at the way then he's staffing key positions within the Republican Party with family members and other cronies and loyalists. And so he has gone a significant way in personalizing the Republican Party. And the key finding that we make in the book is that where leaders come to power backed by personalist parties, the risk of democratic decline, whether it be slow and incremental or the more sudden decisive breaks, the risk of democratic decline goes up very significantly.
Let's tie these two things together, the Ukraine war and, a potential personalized Republican Party where you're vulnerable to someone's emotions. Obviously, Donald Trump is known for saying things that are off the cuff and doing things emotionally. So how much of a risk is that from your perspective on a Trump presidency and our support for Ukraine?
I struggle to answer this question actually quite a lot because you'll hear different things from different corners of the Republican Party. And so again, the major caveat is we just don't know because it's a personalist party. And I think understanding, anticipating the whims of an individual are extremely difficult. They're unpredictable. That's what these personalists, unpredictable in authoritarian regimes, unpredictable in democracies. So it's really hard to know exactly what Trump would do. But my sense of watching his past interactions with Ukraine, his personal affinity towards Putin and other dictators is that he would be very tempted to roll back aid to Ukraine to force Zelensky into a negotiation. I mean, I think he sees the devastation, the loss of life in Ukraine and probably wants it to end. But I think his inclination for bringing it to an end would be to pull the rug out from the Ukrainians and make them concede to agree to the concessions that Russia is forcing on them. And I think then in that case, that will just fuel the flames in the Kremlin, that it will embolden Putin. And even though he might bring an end to the war in Ukraine more quickly, it will set the stage for continued confrontation with Putin and the Kremlin for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, certainly when you combine that with an isolationist tendency, it really gives Putin the red carpet to go into the Baltics and other areas. Did you guys, I'm curious, in your research, do any work on when you have creeping personalism, which we have in the Republican Party, are there ways to stem that tide? Are there examples of situations where we've been able to negotiate with a party so that it doesn't go down that path? Because my view is a lot of my Republican friends are unaware of the danger here. They write things off by saying things like, oh, Putin or Trump just says stuff. He's actually really tough. But you and I agree that it would be a real risk. It's a non-zero risk that Ukraine would have a worse settlement. So any examples of what you do in this situation? I mean, how would you advise Republicans? It doesn't seem like anyone's willing to stand up to him so far.
I mean, this is the really difficult question. I guess we have looked at it more for how would you stop creeping personalism and democratic decay in other countries. And one of the most important factors there is early intervention. A lot of these leaders kind of profess to be Democrats. They want the veneer of democracy, which is why they're slowly chipping away rather than seizing power more decisively. And so early intervention to stop the slide is critically important because once you lose the courts or that civil space closes, it gets even more difficult to claw democracy back. So acting early with things like sanctions, conditionality, visa restrictions, those types of things early on, particularly while you have a civil society that's intact and can leverage those outside interventions to their own benefit, can be useful. And I'll think of, for example, the difference between Hungary and Poland. So Hungary, the backsliding with Orban continued for some time until there was any response for the EU in terms of withholding EU money. Poland, it happened much earlier, and the EU courts got involved. And so we had although we had the Law and Justice Party for many years, and they did damage to Polish democracy, they were voted out of office.
Right.
And so there is a return there. Another example is with Brazil and Bolsonaro. There was very much a story, I think, of civil society and activists who were able to continue to shine a light on abuses and keep those networks alive so that they could mobilize later. But that has to happen early, and the longer it goes, the prospects for reversing it get a lot grimmer. With the Republican Party, I mean, it is about the party. Is the party willing to stand up to the abuses of power? in Trump's first term, it was ultimately because you had key individuals in local government with the Georgia election and other key places, Mike Pence, who ultimately said, stop. And so my worry is that the more that those individuals are sidelined or are intimidated, that the party doesn't push back. I mean, I think, unfortunately, a lot of this has to do with the party and party elites doing the right thing. You have to have party elites who are thinking about the long-term reputation of the party and not just having their fates tied to the one guy, Donald Trump. So it's a lot about the party, and then again, having to the extent to which it matters, having an active civil society, media continuing to shine a light on abuses and other things just to try to continue to push back. But the thing that's just so pernicious about this is even when support and belief in democracy is strong, when you have these people backed by these personalist parties at the top, it's a top-down process. They can chip away at the norms and the institutions slowly and gradually, even when you have a big public support. The final thing I'll say is the polarization, which we haven't talked about, is a key problem. And the problem that we have now is that so many people that the hate for the Democrats is so strong that many people in the Republican Party are willing to tolerate the abuses of power if it means keeping the Democrats out. And that really, then it becomes very difficult to push back when you have people who are willing to watch the abuses of power just because it keeps the other side out. That gets very difficult, I think, to push back against.
Well, on that not so optimistic note, but realistic, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. It's been a great discussion, and I look forward to seeing your work again. I'm going to mention your book one more time because it is so good. It's called The Origins of Elected Strongmen, and it really warns us about what's going on right now in part of the political country. And hopefully we'll talk again in a year, and we'll be at the negotiating table in Ukraine, and we can have a more optimistic conversation. But I think you've given us great perspective. So thank you so much.
Here's hoping, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.